When a cold-hearted billionaire had his loyal maid arrested for a crime she didn't commit, no one expected his 6-year-old daughter to walk into the courtroom, face the judge, and say in front of everyone, "Free my maid and I'll heal you." The entire room burst into laughter. Reporters, lawyers, even the prosecutor thought it was a child's fantasy. But days later, that same judge, who had been paralyzed for years, stood up on his own 2 feet, leaving the world in shock. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard Lancaster was a billionaire known across the world for his success in the technology industry. He had built a massive empire from scratch, but his personal life was very different from the achievements he displayed in business. After his wife died during childbirth, Richard shut himself off emotionally. He chose to live away from the public eye in a huge, quiet mansion with his only daughter, Emily, who was just 6 years old. The house was filled with luxury, high-tech systems, designer furniture, expensive paintings, but it lacked something very basic: warmth. Richard kept himself busy with business calls, video conferences, and long hours in his office. His days were packed with decisions, meetings, and managing companies, leaving no space for personal time. Emily, meanwhile, grew up mostly alone, surrounded by things instead of people. Her father was there physically, but never emotionally. He made sure she had everything she needed: food, clothes, toys. But he didn't sit with her, play with her, or even talk to her much. Emily had her own room full of the best toys money could buy: dolls, stuffed animals, games, and books. But she didn't feel happy. Her days followed the same pattern. She woke up, got dressed with help from a nanny or housekeeper, ate breakfast in silence, and then wandered around the mansion with no one to play with. Sometimes she would try to build small stories with her toys, imagining a family that talked and laughed. Other times, she would just sit by the large windows, watching the trees move outside or looking at the driveway, hoping someone would come visit. But no one ever did. The house was too big and too empty. It was always quiet, with only the sound of her footsteps or distant voices from her father's office. Emily didn't go to school like most kids. She had a private tutor who came in for a few hours each day. But once the lessons were done, she was left alone again, searching for someone to talk to. Her favorite place was a small corner in her room where she kept photos of her mother. She didn't remember her, but she loved looking at her face. Emily would sit on the floor, holding a photo frame, and speak to it like her mother could hear her. She would tell her about her day, about what she ate, or how the new nanny quit again. It was the only time she felt like someone was listening. She didn't fully understand what death meant, but she knew her mother wasn't coming back. Still, talking to the photos made her feel closer to something she never had. Sometimes she asked questions out loud. "Would you read to me if you were here?" Or, "Do you think Daddy still loves me?" But the silence in the room never answered. It was the same every day. Questions without replies, stories without listeners, and a heart that felt too heavy for someone so young. The nannies never lasted. Richard had hired many since Emily was born, hoping one of them could take care of his daughter's needs while he focused on work. But every single one of them left after a few weeks. Some said the house felt too empty and sad. Others couldn't handle the lack of connection from Richard or the loneliness Emily carried with her. The job wasn't hard in the traditional sense. There were no tantrums, no messes, but the emotional weight was too much. Emily rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was quiet, as if she wasn't sure anyone would respond. The new nannies always started with energy and ideas, trying to plan games or lessons, but soon they would stop trying. The silence of the house wore them down. It was hard to stay in a place that looked beautiful on the outside, but felt cold inside. In the end, they would pack their bags, say goodbye gently, and leave, often without giving a clear reason. Richard didn't understand why they kept quitting. He assumed it was just bad hiring or lack of professionalism. He didn't stop to think about the atmosphere of the house or how his absence affected his daughter. He convinced himself that providing everything material would be enough, that by keeping her safe, fed, and surrounded by luxury, he was doing his job as a father. He told himself that emotions were a distraction, and he didn't have time for them. Business was demanding, and his empire depended on his full attention. But deep down, there was a part of him that felt something was wrong. Sometimes, late at night, he would stand outside Emily's door, listening. He could hear her talking to the photos or crying softly. He would pause, hesitate, and then walk away. He didn't know how to comfort her. He didn't know how to be the parent she needed. So he stayed in the only role he understood, the provider. And so, each day ended the same way it started. Emily would lie in her large bed, surrounded by soft toys, looking up at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to come. Sometimes she would whisper goodnight to her mother's picture before closing her eyes. Richard would stay in his office, working late into the night, papers and screens glowing in front of him, completely absorbed in numbers and strategies. The mansion would fall into silence once again, with only the hum of electronics and the ticking of clocks filling the air. The distance between father and daughter grew wider with each passing day, not because they were far in space, but because there was nothing connecting them anymore. Emily lived in a world of quiet dreams and unanswered questions, while Richard hid in a routine that kept him from facing what he had lost and what he was still losing. After yet another nanny decided to leave, the housekeeper, who had been working for the Lancaster family for years, took it upon herself to find someone new. She contacted a small agency that specialized in placing domestic workers and eventually came across Grace Miller. Grace was not like the others. She didn't come with fancy resumes or glowing references from rich families. She lived simply, spoke little, and dressed in plain clothes. During the interview, she listened more than she talked, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and steady. The housekeeper felt something different in her, something solid and quiet. Desperate to break the cycle of short-term hires, she hired Grace without much discussion. Grace arrived at the mansion on a Tuesday morning, carrying only a small suitcase and a soft expression. She didn't ask many questions. She followed instructions carefully and walked through the house as if she understood how to exist without making a sound. She moved with care, not rushing, not hesitating. It didn't take long for Grace to learn her way around the mansion. Within a few days, she already knew where everything was stored, which doors creaked and which lights tended to flicker. But more important than learning the layout of the house was how quickly she connected with Emily. From the beginning, Grace didn't push or insist on anything. She simply made herself available. The first time Emily approached her was during lunch. The girl quietly walked into the kitchen and watched as Grace was slicing fruit. Grace didn't say anything. She simply smiled and offered a piece. Emily took it and stayed there. From that moment, something began to shift. Emily started following Grace from room to room, not speaking much at first, just watching. Then one day she asked Grace to help her pick a dress. Later she asked her to read a story. Grace always responded with calmness, never showing annoyance or rushing through anything. Emily felt safe around her. As the days passed, Emily's behavior began to change. She smiled more often and spoke a little louder. She waited for Grace in the morning and looked for her in the afternoons. Sometimes she would take Grace by the hand and ask her to play. They would sit on the floor of her room, surrounded by dolls, and Grace would listen as Emily made up little stories. At night, Emily no longer stared at the ceiling alone. She waited for Grace to come and read her a story before bed. Grace would sit beside her and read slowly, letting the girl look at the pictures and ask questions. Emily still talked to the photo of her mother, but now she had someone else to talk to too. Grace never tried to replace anyone. She never promised anything or talked about the past. She simply stayed, day after day, always calm, always present. And for Emily, that was enough. It was the first time in a long while that someone stayed. Richard noticed the change, although he didn't say much. At first, he treated Grace like he had treated all the others, politely but distantly. He gave her no special attention. His routine stayed the same: long work hours, short meals, and late nights in the office. But after a few weeks, he started to notice things. Emily was more cheerful. The sound of her voice carried farther in the hallways. There were fewer complaints from the housekeeper. One evening, Richard saw Grace and Emily in the garden, sitting on a bench, talking. He didn't interrupt. He just watched for a few seconds and walked away. Grace didn't try to impress him. She didn't make suggestions or bring up conversations. She did her work quietly. Her presence was steady, and her habits were simple. Richard found himself watching her more often, during breakfast preparations, during story time with Emily. But he still didn't say anything. He wasn't sure how to react to the calmness she brought. Over time, the entire atmosphere of the mansion changed. It was still big and quiet, but the silence wasn't as heavy. There was a sense of order, not just in how things were cleaned or arranged, but in how people moved and interacted. Grace followed a clear routine. She started her mornings early, completed her tasks with care, and always made time for Emily. She made sure the child had clean clothes, healthy meals, and someone to talk to. She didn't try to take over the household. She respected boundaries, followed rules, and stayed out of Richard's way. But her work had an impact. The staff seemed more relaxed. Emily was more open. Even the housekeeper, who had been stressed for months, commented on how much smoother things felt. Grace never called attention to herself, but her presence was noticeable in the small changes that started adding up. For the first time in years, life inside the mansion didn't feel so heavy. Grace never talked much about herself. No one knew where she came from exactly, or why she had chosen to work in such a lonely house, but she didn't seem uncomfortable with the quiet. In fact, it looked like she understood it. She spoke when needed, listened carefully, and always treated Emily with patience and care. She didn't act surprised when the girl asked strange or sad questions. She just answered simply or stayed quiet with her, which often helped more. Richard remained mostly in the background, watching things unfold. Sometimes he thought about asking Grace questions or thanking her, but the words didn't come easily to him. So he kept his distance, observing the way Emily had started to depend on her. Grace didn't try to win anyone over, but somehow she made things better. The house, which had been cold and distant for so long, now had something new in it, a feeling of calm, brought not by big gestures, but by Grace simply being there and doing her job with quiet dedication. Emily's bond with Grace grew stronger every day. What started with small interactions slowly turned into a deep connection. Emily would wake up and look for Grace immediately, often asking where she was if she wasn't nearby. Grace started including Emily in her daily tasks, and the girl followed her everywhere. They made breakfast together, with Emily helping to crack eggs or mix pancake batter. Grace never rushed her, even if it made the process slower. After meals, they would spend time in the garden pulling out weeds or watering the plants. Emily liked digging small holes in the dirt and placing seeds inside, even if they weren't always planted properly. Grace guided her with patience, always allowing her to try things on her own. At night, they invented stories together. Emily would start with a character, and Grace would help build a little adventure around it. Sometimes they laughed, other times Emily grew quiet and just listened. It became part of their routine, something they both looked forward to. One night, after their story, Emily hugged Grace tightly and whispered, "Good night, Mommy." The words surprised Grace. She froze for a second, unsure how to react. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She didn't correct the girl or pull away. Instead, she held Emily a little tighter and whispered back, "Good night, sweetheart." It was the first time Emily had called her that. The moment hit Grace deeply. She knew she wasn't Emily's mother, and she had never tried to take that place. But hearing those words filled her with something she couldn't explain. She didn't know if she should be happy or scared. Emily had never known her real mother, and now, after so much loneliness, she had chosen Grace as a source of comfort. Grace couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, when Emily called her mommy again while they were planting flowers, Grace smiled but didn't respond. She didn't know what the right thing to do was anymore. Their daily activities became even more meaningful after that. Grace would let Emily help wash vegetables in the kitchen and teach her how to fold napkins neatly for the table. They would sit outside on the back steps during breaks and drink juice together. Emily asked Grace about her life, even though she didn't get many answers. Grace kept most of her past to herself, but she always listened when Emily talked. Sometimes Emily would tell her about dreams she had or questions she was too shy to ask her father. Grace gave her honest, gentle replies. One afternoon, when Emily scraped her knee, she ran straight to Grace and not to the housekeeper or staff. Grace cleaned the wound, put on a bandage, and stayed with her until she stopped crying. In those quiet, everyday moments, Emily felt safe. The affection between them was clear to anyone who observed it, but they didn't talk about it openly. It just became part of how they were around each other. Richard eventually noticed the closeness between Grace and his daughter. He wasn't blind to the change. Emily smiled more, talked more, and showed less fear of being alone, but he didn't see it as something positive. Instead of understanding it as emotional healing, he saw it as a possible problem. He started feeling uncomfortable with how often Emily referred to Grace, how she wanted to be around her all the time. He began to worry that Emily was becoming too attached. To him, it felt like she was confusing roles, that she was seeing Grace as a replacement mother. This idea didn't sit well with him. One evening, after watching from the hallway as Grace tucked Emily into bed, Richard asked her to come to his office. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. He sat at his desk and told her plainly that he had noticed the bond between her and his daughter, and while he appreciated her work, he didn't want Emily to grow emotionally dependent on her. The conversation was difficult for Grace. She stood quietly in front of Richard's desk, listening to every word without interrupting. He wasn't angry, but he was firm. He said he needed to protect his daughter's emotional stability and that things were becoming too personal. Grace nodded respectfully. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. But inside, she felt torn. She understood his concern, and she didn't want to cause confusion or cross boundaries. Still, hearing that she needed to hold back made her feel like she was being asked to pull away from something real. She had never pushed Emily to see her as a mother. She had only been kind, present, and supportive, and yet those simple actions had created a connection that now seemed to be a problem. Grace returned to her room that night, feeling heavy. She kept thinking about Emily and how that one word, "mommy," had changed everything. She wanted to do what was right, but she wasn't sure what that meant anymore. The next day, Grace acted as usual. She prepared breakfast, helped Emily dress, and went through their regular activities. But inside, she was more guarded. She tried not to respond when Emily used the word mommy, even though it stung to ignore it. Emily noticed the change. She didn't understand it, but she felt it. Grace still smiled, still helped her, but something was different. The warmth was there, but less open. Emily didn't say anything at first, but by the end of the day she asked, "Did I do something wrong?" Grace knelt down and looked into her eyes. "No, sweetie, you didn't do anything wrong." Then she gave her a soft hug and changed the subject. The bond between them hadn't broken, but something had shifted. Grace was now caught between doing her job by the rules and caring for the girl with her whole heart. And while she continued to stay by Emily's side, the question of how close she was allowed to be remained silently between them. After returning from a 3-day business trip in New York, Richard arrived back at the mansion late in the evening. He went straight to his study, as he usually did, to go over paperwork and check on things that had piled up in his absence. Everything seemed normal until he decided to open the safe hidden behind a panel in the wall. He hadn't touched it in months, but something made him want to look at the diamond necklace that had once belonged to his late wife. It was a family heirloom and one of the last physical reminders of her. He opened the safe, entered the code, and pulled out the small black case from the hidden compartment. But when he opened it, the necklace wasn't there. The case was empty. At first, he thought maybe he had moved it to another safe or placed it elsewhere. He searched the drawers, his bedroom, and even the guest rooms, but the necklace was nowhere to be found. His confusion quickly turned into concern. Richard didn't say anything to the staff right away. He chose to ask quiet questions during the next morning. He approached the housekeeper, the butler, and a few cleaners, asking if anyone had entered his study while he was gone. They all denied it. He asked if they had seen anyone near the wall safe. Again, they said no. Their answers didn't seem dishonest, but they didn't help. He spoke with the security technician responsible for maintaining the house's systems and asked if there had been any technical issues or alerts during his trip. The technician said everything had functioned normally. Still, the missing necklace remained unexplained. That's when Richard called Thomas Blake, his personal lawyer and longtime advisor. Thomas came over within the hour. After hearing the story, Thomas didn't hesitate to bring up a possibility Richard hadn't considered yet. Maybe someone inside the house took it. Someone with regular access, someone who could blend in and not raise suspicion, someone like a nanny. Richard listened to Thomas carefully. At first he felt unsure, but Thomas was calm and confident. He reminded Richard that the necklace was in a hidden part of the safe, not something a random guest or temporary staff member would even know about. He then brought up Grace. She had been getting close to Emily, spending more time with her than anyone else. Maybe she had earned the girl's trust and used it to learn about private parts of the house. Maybe Emily said something without meaning to. Thomas wasn't aggressive, but he made his point clearly. Richard didn't want to believe Grace would do something like that. But the situation didn't leave him much room. The necklace was missing, and someone had to be responsible. Feeling frustrated and suspicious, Richard ordered the security staff to review the camera footage from the past week. Every hallway, entrance, and common area was under surveillance. He wanted answers, fast. The security team spent several hours reviewing footage. They checked every frame from the past 7 days, watching who entered the study, who walked near the safe wall, and who spent time alone in rooms. But the cameras didn't show anything unusual. Grace was seen moving about the house like always, taking care of Emily, preparing meals, folding laundry. There was no clear footage of her near the safe or doing anything suspicious. Still, Richard wasn't satisfied. The absence of evidence didn't give him peace. He believed that someone who planned carefully wouldn't get caught on camera, and Grace had been in the house long enough to understand the layout, the staff's schedules, and the places people avoided. Thomas continued to point out that her connection with Emily gave her more access than anyone else. In the end, without any clear proof but filled with pressure and doubt, Richard made a choice. He called the police and reported the necklace as stolen. He gave them all the details and mentioned Grace by name. The police arrived in the afternoon. 2 officers came in through the main entrance, asking to speak to Grace. She was in the kitchen, helping Emily pour juice into a glass. When she saw the uniforms, she looked confused but calm. The officers informed her that she was being taken in for questioning related to a stolen item. She asked what this was about, but they didn't explain much. They told her she would have the chance to speak at the station. Then, without waiting, they handcuffed her in front of everyone. Emily was standing just a few feet away. At first, she didn't understand what was happening. She looked up at Grace and then at the officers. Grace tried to smile at her, but her eyes were starting to fill with tears. The girl called her name, confused and afraid. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Why are they doing this?" No one answered. The house staff stood frozen. No one moved. No one spoke up. Emily ran toward Grace, grabbing her arm. One of the officers gently pulled her away. Richard stepped into the room at that moment. He didn't speak to Grace or Emily. He only nodded at the police to continue. Emily looked at her father, crying, begging him to stop it. "She didn't do anything. She's my friend," she shouted. But Richard didn't respond. His face was unreadable. Grace didn't argue. She simply lowered her head and walked out with the officers. Emily stood there, stunned. The hallway felt empty. She didn't understand why her father had allowed this to happen or what Grace had done wrong. To her, none of it made sense. She had just lost someone she trusted more than anyone else in the world. The house, which had finally started to feel warm, suddenly felt cold again. As the police car pulled away from the mansion with Grace inside, Emily stood at the window, waiting for someone to explain, but no one did. Grace was taken to the courthouse early in the morning. She had barely slept in the holding cell the night before, and her eyes were tired but calm. She wore the same simple clothes she had been arrested in, and her hands were still slightly red from the tight handcuffs. When she arrived at the courthouse, officers led her through a side entrance to avoid the growing crowd outside. News had spread quickly since the arrest. A few reporters had already gathered, taking pictures and calling out questions. Inside, the courtroom was quiet at first, filled with murmurs and the rustling of papers. Richard had not come. Only a few members of the household staff were present. The judge assigned to the case was Harold Moore, a man with a reputation for being strict, logical, and unemotional. He'd served on the bench for over 20 years and now used a wheelchair due to a car accident many years ago. His expression was serious as he entered the courtroom. Emily had come with one of the security guards from the house. She wasn't supposed to be there, but after begging the housekeeper and crying non-stop since Grace's arrest, they decided it might be better to let her attend quietly. She sat at the back of the courtroom with the guard, fidgeting in her seat and watching everything closely. She didn't understand all the legal words being used or why so many people looked upset, but she knew one thing: Grace didn't deserve to be there. As the judge called the session to order, Emily saw Grace across the room, standing behind the defense table with a public attorney. Emily's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't stay still any longer. She slipped out of the bench before the guard could stop her and started walking quickly toward the front of the courtroom. When someone tried to grab her arm, she broke into a run. The room went silent. All eyes turned toward her. She reached the judge's bench without hesitation and grabbed Judge Moore's hands. He was stunned, unsure of how to respond. Emily looked directly into his eyes, her voice trembling but clear. "If you let my mummy go, I'll help you walk again," she said. Her voice echoed in the silent courtroom. The judge froze. No one moved. Even the clerk stopped typing. Grace covered her mouth with her hands, trying not to cry out loud. The moment was powerful, unexpected, and deeply emotional. Emily wasn't yelling. She wasn't throwing a tantrum. She was simply making a promise from the deepest part of her heart. To her, it wasn't a joke, it wasn't a trick. She believed it, and her words were full of honesty. The judge looked at her, stunned. For a moment, the courtroom was no longer a courtroom. It was just a room with a little girl who missed someone she loved and wanted her back. Judge Moore took a few seconds before reacting. He slowly placed his hands on Emily's and nodded once, still processing what had just happened. Then he looked at the officers and quietly instructed them to take a short break. The session was paused, and everyone was ordered to leave the room for a few minutes. Grace was allowed to sit, and Emily was guided back to the bench, where the security guard now sat speechless. Whispers filled the hallway. Phones had recorded everything. A few people had taken pictures. One video clip showed the exact moment Emily made her promise. Within minutes, it began spreading online. News outlets picked it up immediately. Headlines started appearing. Little girl stuns courtroom with heartbreaking plea. Child's words shake judge. And who is Grace Miller? The story had left the courthouse and was now reaching thousands of people. What had started as a quiet preliminary hearing had become something entirely different. By the time the hearing resumed, the judge had reviewed Grace's background and requested a full re-examination of the case. He stated publicly that the emotional moment, while not legal evidence, had shown that the situation might deserve closer inspection. He called for the original report, camera footage, and employee records to be brought forward and reviewed by an independent team. Grace's public attorney requested her release until the full investigation was complete, arguing that she had no criminal history, had not attempted to flee, and had close ties to the community. The judge agreed to delay any formal charges and ordered Grace to be released under supervision. Emily jumped from her seat and ran to her again, this time into her open arms. Grace held her tightly. She whispered to Emily, "I don't know how you did that, but thank you." Emily just said, "I meant it." The courtroom watched in silence. No one dared interrupt them. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited for statements. Grace didn't speak to them. She walked straight to the car, with Emily holding her hand. The judge didn't give interviews either. He simply returned to his chambers and closed the door, deep in thought. The scene had affected him in a way no legal case ever had. That night, Grace was allowed to return to the mansion temporarily while the review continued. Richard, watching the media storm on TV, didn't know what to think. He had acted based on suspicion and advice. Now, everything was spiraling beyond his control. He sat in silence while the news replayed the courtroom footage again and again. The country had now seen the story of Emily and Grace, and opinions were forming quickly. Some people were angry, others were touched, but no one was ignoring it. The case had become more than a theft investigation. It had become a symbol of something deeper, a story about connection, trust, and the unexpected voice of a child. Back at the mansion, things were not the same for Emily. Grace was no longer seen as a criminal, but the trust inside the house had been broken. Emily, still shaken from everything that had happened, stayed quiet and distant. She spent most of her time in her room or walking silently through the halls. At night, she would lie awake, thinking about how to help Grace and make things right. One afternoon, while passing by her father's office, she remembered something Grace once told her. "Sometimes the truth is not far. You just need to look in the right place." That sentence stayed in her mind. Emily waited until late at night, when everyone was asleep. She tiptoed down the hallway and into Richard's office. She closed the door slowly and started looking through drawers, boxes, and folders. Most of it looked like business papers, but she didn't really understand the details. She was looking for something, anything, that could prove Grace didn't take the necklace. Emily didn't find anything that first night, but she didn't give up. Over the next few days, she returned to the office secretly during early mornings or late evenings. She learned how to open drawers without making noise and how to return everything exactly the way it was. One day, she remembered the cameras. Her father kept digital backups of all security footage on a private server. Emily didn't know much about computers, but she remembered an old friend from the past, a man named Carl, who used to work in the security department of the mansion. He was kind to her when she was younger and had even shown her how the cameras worked once. Emily found his phone number in an old contact book in the kitchen. She called him from the landline and asked him to meet her behind the garden gate, far from the house where no one could hear. Carl, curious and concerned, agreed. She explained everything she was trying to do, and he agreed to help. Carl came back to the mansion pretending he was there to check on an old system. While inside, he logged into the server and showed Emily how to search for past footage. They focused on the dates when her father was away on his business trip, the time when the necklace went missing. After hours of looking through the recordings, Emily found what she was looking for. The camera in the hallway outside Richard's office showed Thomas Blake, the lawyer, walking toward the study late at night. He didn't seem rushed, but he looked around before entering. A few minutes later, he was seen inside the office, flipping through folders and walking toward the area where the hidden safe was. Emily froze while watching it. She had trusted Thomas, just like her father did. She never imagined he would go that far. Carl copied the footage to a pen drive and handed it to Emily. She thanked him quietly and hid the pen drive deep inside her backpack. After discovering the truth, Emily couldn't bring herself to speak to her father. Every time she saw him, she turned away or walked in the opposite direction. She refused to eat during meals, barely answered questions, and avoided eye contact. Richard noticed right away. At first, he thought she was still upset because of Grace's arrest, but then he started to feel something more: guilt. He tried to talk to her several times, but she either stayed silent or responded with short words. He knocked on her door one evening and asked if she wanted to talk, but she didn't answer. He left a tray of food by the door, hoping she would eat, but the plate stayed untouched. Emily didn't trust him anymore. In her mind, he had turned his back on Grace without trying to understand the truth. She felt angry and disappointed, not just at him, but at herself for not doing something sooner. She decided she had to fix it, with or without his help. While Emily kept her distance, Thomas Blake began to feel uneasy. He had no idea that Emily had seen the footage or that Carl had returned, but he noticed something strange. 2 other employees had started acting nervous around him. He suspected someone might know something. Without being obvious, he began speaking to staff in private, warning them to keep quiet about anything they might have seen. His words weren't direct threats, but they were heavy with pressure. He reminded them of their contracts, of how easily people could lose jobs or face legal problems. Some staff grew uncomfortable but didn't know what to do. No one wanted to get involved, and no one felt powerful enough to confront him. Thomas moved carefully, trying to stay one step ahead. He still didn't think Emily could be a problem. She was just a child in his eyes, quiet and emotional. But he underestimated her. Emily had already decided she wouldn't wait for anyone to act. She had a plan of her own. Emily knew that showing the footage to her father wasn't enough. He had already made one mistake by trusting the wrong person. This time she wanted to make sure there would be no more doubts, so she put the pen drive in a small envelope and wrote a short note. "Please watch the video. It's important." She didn't sign her name. She placed the envelope inside her school backpack and asked the housekeeper to take her into town, saying she needed a new book. But instead of going to the bookstore, Emily asked to be dropped off near the courthouse. She walked straight to the prosecutor's office. A secretary tried to stop her, asking for her name and reason for being there, but Emily insisted it was urgent. After a short wait, she was allowed to speak with a junior attorney, who was surprised by how serious the little girl sounded. Emily handed him the envelope without explaining too much. "This will help Grace," she said. Then she turned around and left. The pen drive Emily delivered to the prosecutor's office was received with curiosity. The junior attorney who opened the envelope was surprised to find a simple USB device with a note attached. The note read, "Please watch the video. It's important." He inserted the drive into his computer and played the file. As the video started, it became immediately clear that the footage was security camera material. It showed Thomas Blake walking into Richard Lancaster's office alone at a suspicious hour. The room was dark, and Thomas appeared cautious, looking around before stepping fully inside. He moved confidently, as if he knew exactly where to go. Then he walked to the wall, opened the hidden panel, and accessed the safe. The footage showed him handling something inside, although the object itself wasn't visible, but it was clear. He had no reason to be there, and he had touched the safe. The attorney paused the video and immediately called his superior. Within hours, the footage was sent directly to Judge Harold Moore. Judge Moore, known for being strict and careful, watched the footage in silence. He didn't react immediately, but his expression grew more serious by the second. He had been reviewing the case carefully ever since Emily's emotional plea during the earlier hearing. Now, with visual evidence in hand, everything changed. The images confirmed that Thomas had entered the office alone and accessed the safe without permission. That fact, combined with the timeline of the necklace's disappearance, left no room for doubt. The judge called for an urgent meeting with the prosecution team and ordered an immediate review of the charges against Grace Miller. The evidence proved her innocence beyond question. Within hours, the prosecutor filed an official motion to drop all accusations and release Grace from custody. Judge Moore signed the release papers the same day. The news traveled fast. Supporters who had followed Grace's case gathered outside the prison gates, holding signs and waiting to see her walk out. When she finally did, they applauded and cheered loudly. Grace stepped out of the building slowly, unsure of what to expect. She wore the same clothes she'd been arrested in, now wrinkled and worn. As she walked through the prison gates, the crowd clapped and some people even cried. Reporters shouted questions, but she said nothing. A staff member from the prosecutor's office guided her to a waiting car that would take her back to the city. At the same time, the news reached Richard Lancaster at his office. He was reviewing reports when his assistant came in and told him what had happened. At first, he didn't understand. "What do you mean she's free?" he asked. Then he was shown the footage. He watched in disbelief as Thomas appeared on screen, clearly tampering with his office safe. Richard couldn't move. The guilt hit him all at once. He had trusted the wrong person, accused the wrong person, and hurt the only person who had truly been there for his daughter. He felt ashamed. Later that day, Richard called Thomas Blake into his office. He didn't wait long. As soon as Thomas walked in, Richard confronted him with the video. "Explain this," Richard said, pressing play. Thomas's face changed. He tried to lie at first, saying he was looking for legal documents. Richard didn't believe a word. "You had no reason to touch that safe," he said. Thomas stayed quiet. Richard pressed harder, demanding answers, but eventually Thomas stopped talking. Security entered the office moments later, followed by local police. Richard handed over the footage himself. Thomas was arrested on the spot, charged with obstruction of justice and qualified theft. He didn't resist. He just looked down and let the officers take him. Richard stood in silence as they led his former lawyer and friend away. The weight of his decisions sank in even deeper. He had nearly destroyed Grace's life. He had broken his daughter's trust. And he had done all of it without checking the facts first. That night, Emily sat on the stairs of the mansion, hugging a pillow and waiting. When the car pulled up and Grace stepped out, Emily ran toward her without hesitation. Grace dropped her small bag and caught her in her arms. They stayed like that for a moment, not saying anything. The house staff watched from a distance, quietly relieved. Grace returned to the mansion at Emily's request. She didn't ask questions, and she didn't make demands. She just came back because Emily needed her. Richard met her in the hallway a few minutes later. He looked tired, pale, and nervous. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he said, "I'm sorry." He apologized for everything. For the arrest, for the doubt, for not protecting her when he should have. Grace nodded slowly. "I know," she replied. There was no anger in her voice, just quiet sadness. Richard didn't expect forgiveness, but Grace didn't walk away either. They both knew things couldn't go back to the way they were overnight. Over the next few days, the mansion began to feel a little less heavy. Emily started smiling again. She helped Grace unpack her things and asked if they could return to their garden routine. Grace said yes. Richard kept his distance at first, but slowly started joining them for breakfast. The conversations were short and sometimes awkward, but they were real. One evening, he sat with Emily and asked if she wanted to read a story together. She agreed. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't fix everything, but it was a start. Grace didn't leave. She stayed, not because she was forced to, but because she wanted to help Emily feel safe again. The three of them were still healing, each in their own way, but the truth had come out, and justice had been served. For Emily, that was enough. She had fought for someone she loved and had been brave when no one else was. Now, sitting between her father and Grace, she finally felt at peace. Emily sat on the living room floor, flipping through one of her storybooks, but her mind wasn't really on the pages. She was thinking about Judge Moore. Days had passed since Grace came back home, and everything had started to settle down again. But Emily couldn't forget the words she said in the courtroom. "If you let my mommy go, I'll help you walk again." It hadn't been just something to say, she meant it. That promise stayed in her mind every day. One morning, she walked up to her father while he was having coffee and said, "Daddy, we need to help the judge. I promised him." Richard looked at her, confused. He had been focused on work and repairing the damage caused by his mistake. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" he asked. Emily explained word by word that she had made a promise and she wanted to keep it. She asked him to help. At first, Richard didn't take it seriously, but Emily didn't let it go. Emily brought it up again the next day, and the day after that. She reminded Richard of the promise she made in front of everyone, and how the judge had paused when she said it. "He listened to me," she said. "Now we have to help him." Richard was still doubtful, but he could see how important this was to his daughter. He began doing research, looking up treatments for spinal cord injuries, physical therapy programs, and new medical technologies. He contacted several hospitals, made calls, and spoke to doctors. Most said there was little they could do after so many years, but one specialist mentioned a newer method using neurostimulation. It was expensive and experimental, but it had shown results in some patients with similar conditions. Richard used his name and contacts to get a direct appointment with the lead doctor. He explained the story briefly about the judge, the child, the promise. The clinic agreed to evaluate the case, more out of curiosity than confidence. When Judge Moore received the call about the evaluation, he wasn't sure how to react. He had lived with paralysis for a long time. Doctors had told him more than once that there was no solution. He didn't want to get his hopes up, but when he heard it was Emily who pushed for it, he paused. He remembered her small hands holding his that day in court, and the promise she made with such confidence. Something about her words had stayed with him. Maybe he didn't believe in miracles, but he believed in people. He agreed to go for the consultation. The day of the appointment, Richard and Emily met him at the clinic. He was quiet, almost awkward, but Emily was calm. She held his hand again while he was wheeled into the exam room. The specialists ran a full series of tests, scans, muscle response readings, and reflex checks. The results surprised them. There was still slight muscle activity in his legs, something that gave them a reason to try. The treatment plan was intense. Judge Moore would need to go through daily physical therapy, frequent neurostimulation sessions using advanced equipment, and regular meetings with a psychologist to help him adjust. It wasn't going to be easy. There were no guarantees. But there was now a possibility, and that was enough to begin. Emily attended the first few sessions. She sat quietly during the exercises, sometimes holding a book or watching the machines closely. When the therapy got too difficult, she would squeeze the judge's hand and tell him, "Don't stop, you're doing good." He didn't say much, but he listened to her. The medical team noted how unusual the situation was, a child being involved in such a serious recovery. But they also noticed something else. The judge responded better when Emily was around. His mood changed. He became more motivated. After a few sessions, the muscles in his legs began to react slightly better. The progress was slow, but it was real. Word about the judge's therapy began to spread. Doctors who once thought there was no chance were now taking an interest. Emily remained consistent, attending sessions when she could, bringing simple drawings to decorate the room, or reading out loud during rest periods. Richard watched all of it closely. He began coming more often, not just to support his daughter, but because he had started to care. He saw how Judge Moore, who once looked distant and serious, now looked focused and open. He saw how Emily's presence seemed to push everyone to try harder. One afternoon, after a long session, a nurse pulled Richard aside and said, "You should be proud of her. She's not just helping him. She's inspiring all of us." Richard didn't say anything right away. He looked at his daughter sitting next to the judge, both smiling at something on the screen. That image stayed with him. For the first time, he was beginning to understand just how special his daughter really was. More weeks passed. The therapy continued, and Judge Moore made slow but steady progress. His legs could now twitch on command, and he could feel slight pressure during certain exercises. The team remained cautious, but their tone changed. They talked less about limits and more about goals. Emily never missed a chance to remind the judge of his promise to her now. "You said you'd try, and you are." Judge Moore, who once barely showed emotion, began smiling more around her. Richard, too, was changing. He started spending more time at home, talking with Emily, asking about her thoughts, listening to what she cared about. He apologized again for not seeing the truth earlier, and this time Emily nodded and said, "It's okay now." Their bond was slowly being repaired. Grace, still a calm and steady presence in the house, watched over them both. In the end, Emily's promise became more than words. It became action, healing, and a path that connected them all in a way none of them had expected. After several weeks of intense and carefully monitored treatment, Judge Harold Moore began to show clear and promising signs of progress. What started as small, almost invisible movements in his legs slowly developed into controlled motion. First, he was able to move his toes, then his feet. With time, he managed to flex his ankles slightly. The therapy team stayed focused and cautious, adjusting his sessions as needed. They introduced a standing frame, which helped him get used to bearing weight on his legs again. He needed support from both sides, but the fact that he could stand at all was a huge victory. The emotional weight of those first moments standing was clear on his face. Though he didn't say much, he held onto the parallel bars longer than necessary, taking it all in. Emily, who had been there for almost every session, clapped and cheered from her chair, her smile bigger than ever. "See? I told you," she said, and the judge just nodded, holding back his emotions. As progress continued, the medical team suggested a symbolic return to the courthouse, not for work, but for a visit. The idea was simple: show that healing was possible and give the judge a chance to thank those who had supported him. News of his recovery had spread, mostly due to Emily's story. The public had followed her promise, the treatment, and now they were eager to see the result. The event was organized with help from state representatives, court staff, and even some medical professionals. On the day of the visit, the courthouse lobby was full. Reporters, judges, lawyers, and clerks stood together waiting. Cameras were positioned at the back. The room went quiet when Judge Moore entered in his wheelchair, pushed by a nurse. But instead of staying seated, he reached for the handles of a walker. Slowly and carefully, with the help of two therapists on either side, he stood up in front of everyone. A few gasps were heard. No one expected it. Step by step, the judge began walking across the courtroom floor. Each step was slow and required effort, but his focus never broke. The room remained completely silent. No one moved, afraid to interrupt the moment. He used the walker for balance, his arms tense but his face steady. When he reached the center, he turned toward the crowd. He looked out across the room and said, "I never imagined I would stand here again, literally. I owe this moment to many people, but one person in particular reminded me what determination really means." He looked at Emily, who was sitting in the front row. She made a promise, and because of her, I made one to myself, to not give up. The room remained quiet for a second longer before the sound of hands clapping filled the space. Emily stood up, ran toward him, and hugged him tightly. She held on to him without saying a word, her face buried in his chest. He gently placed his hand on her back. The applause continued for a while. People stood, some with tears in their eyes. Even the officials in suits and ties, used to being serious and composed, couldn't help but join in. Richard stood in the back of the room, watching everything. His eyes were watery, and he didn't try to hide it. He had followed every step of the recovery, but seeing the final result in that courtroom was different. It was real. It was public. It was powerful. He made his way to the front, waited for the noise to settle, and then asked to speak. Holding the microphone with a slightly unsteady hand, he said, "My daughter taught me something I'll never forget. I thought I knew how to fix things, with power, with money, with control. But what she did, what she believed in, was stronger than all of that. She didn't just help Judge Moore walk again. She showed us what it means to fight for what's right, even when you're small, even when nobody listens at first." Reporters captured every second of it. Grace, standing quietly off to the side, watched with a hand over her heart. She didn't need to speak. Her eyes said everything. She had been there from the beginning. She had felt the pain of being falsely accused, the fear of losing everything, and now she was seeing justice play out, not just through courts and legal systems, but through a child's heart and persistence. Emily returned to her seat next to her father, who wrapped his arm around her shoulders. He didn't say anything, but she felt it. The room slowly returned to calm. Judge Moore sat again, clearly exhausted but happy. He looked over at Grace and gave her a small nod of respect. No words were exchanged, but they understood each other. Everyone in the room had been changed by what they witnessed that day. It wasn't just about healing, it was about truth, courage, and second chances. In the days that followed, the story of what happened in the courtroom spread across the country. News stations played the footage repeatedly, Judge Moore standing and walking, Emily's hug, Richard's speech. Articles were written about the recovery, the false accusation, and the little girl who never gave up. Social media users shared posts with hashtags like Emily the Brave and Justice and Hope. Her name quickly became a symbol. Schools talked about her in class, community groups shared her story. People from different places and backgrounds said they felt inspired by what she did. She didn't understand the full impact of it all, but she liked knowing the judge could walk again. That was enough for her. At home, life continued slowly. Grace stayed, helping around the house and taking care of Emily. Richard spent more time at home, leaving work early and asking more questions about his daughter's day. They weren't perfect, but they were together. And for Emily, that was all she had ever wanted. Emily's story quickly spread beyond the courtroom and into homes across the country. News reports, online videos, and magazine articles shared every detail, from the day she stood in front of Judge Moore to the moment he took his first steps with the help of a walker. People were moved not just by the medical progress, but by the heart behind it. A little girl had made a promise and kept it, Her courage and kindness became something bigger than just one case. She was invited to speak at schools and events, but Richard always made sure her childhood came first. She wasn't a celebrity in their home. She was just Emily, the same girl who liked pancakes for breakfast and building puzzles on the living room floor. Still, her story had power. It started conversations about justice, family, and forgiveness. Wanting to turn that momentum into action, Richard created a foundation in Emily's name. Its mission was clear: to help children caught in legal battles and support families hurt by injustice. The foundation grew fast. With Richard's resources and connections, it didn't take long for it to attract support from lawyers, counselors, and child advocates. But it wasn't just about big donors or public image. Richard wanted the organization to feel real and personal. Every program they created was inspired by what they had lived through: false accusations, broken trust, and the long journey toward healing. One of the first people to join the project was Judge Harold Moore. After retiring from his career with honor, he agreed to act as a senior advisor for the foundation. He said yes, not just out of duty, but because he believed in what Emily had started. He often spoke about second chances and the power of truth, drawing from his own recovery. Staff and volunteers respected him deeply. He had become living proof of what hope could do. His presence brought wisdom and structure, while Emily's story reminded everyone why their work mattered. Life at the Lancaster mansion changed completely. What was once a quiet, cold place now felt alive. Laughter echoed through the halls, and each room held a new kind of energy. Grace was no longer just a caretaker. She was officially named Emily's legal co-guardian alongside Richard. The decision came naturally. She had never forced herself into that role, but her actions had already proven her dedication. A court formalized what Emily had already known for a long time. Grace was part of the family. They continued living under the same roof, sharing responsibilities and routines. Grace helped with homework, cooked meals, and listened whenever Emily had questions about life. Richard, too, had changed. He was more present, more patient, and more open. The three of them built a life not based on perfection, but on real care. They didn't follow traditional rules of what a family should be. They just focused on being there for each other every day, in the ways that mattered most. Emily remained a regular child, even with all the attention around her. She still had days where she got grumpy, lost interest in schoolwork, or wanted to play instead of do chores. But there was something unique about her that people always noticed. She had a way of listening closely, caring deeply, and believing in people, even when others had given up. Grace often said Emily had an old heart, not because she acted like an adult, but because she understood emotions in a way that was rare for someone her age. Richard encouraged her curiosity. He bought books about history, law, science, anything she showed interest in. They still made time to go out as a family, sometimes just to eat ice cream or walk in the park. These small outings became their favorite thing. They took photos, created new memories, and filled the mansion with framed moments. Every hallway that once felt cold now displayed pieces of a life rebuilt, one kind moment at a time. As the foundation expanded, more families reached out for help. Some were facing unfair custody battles. Others had children dealing with trauma from legal systems that didn't understand their needs. Grace took on an active role, meeting with families, helping design support programs, and making sure the foundation stayed focused on people, not just paperwork. Judge Moore visited often, helping to guide the team, especially on complex cases. Emily sometimes joined them too, not because she had to, but because she wanted to listen. She would sit quietly during meetings, drawing in her notebook, and then later ask important questions that surprised everyone. Richard continued funding the foundation, but now spent less time at the office and more time at home. He felt like he was finally where he belonged, not just as a businessman, but as a father. The house had changed, the people had changed, and so had he. They had all grown from a painful chapter into something much more hopeful and full of purpose. One afternoon, as the sun was setting, Richard, Grace, and Emily went for a walk along the path behind the mansion. They didn't plan it. They just felt like being outside. Richard walked slowly, hands in his pockets, while Grace and Emily talked about what to cook for dinner. As they reached the edge of the garden, someone stood nearby, watching quietly. It was Judge Moore. He stood upright, without his walker, using only a cane now. His eyes followed them with warmth and pride. Richard waved. Grace smiled. Emily ran over and hugged him, holding tight as always. It was a simple scene, but one that said everything. They had all been broken in different ways, but they were healing together. The house, once silent and cold, had become a place of second chances, a place of real love, a place where truth, even when painful, led to something better. Emily's name had become more than a headline. It was now a symbol of justice, compassion, and the family they chose to be. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.